Hello, intro students. As you can see from the different angle that I'm talking to you now from, I'm learning the technology. I'm getting better at it. And so these videos, I think, are getting easier for me. And as you can also tell from the different angle that I'm coming to you from my library slash storage room. Uh, but anyway, so let's get into the material. Today we're going to be discussing race and ethnicity. Um, and so we're going to be talking about chapter 9 in the Henslin textbook. All right. So, race and ethnicity is a topic that most people don't like, most Americans, I should say, don't like to discuss. It's something that uh, causes conflict. It's something that makes people feel uncomfortable, especially considering the very painful history on race and ethnicity that the United States has. Now, let's first start by defining some basic terms. Race and ethnicity are oftentimes used as though they were interchangeable, and they're not. They're actually very different meanings, but they're connected. They're related to one another. So, race would be more about phenotypic characteristics. Now, you may remember from earlier in the semester when I was talking about the differences between phenotypes and genotypes in genetics. So, your genotype would be your deeper genetics, so what makes you human, right? And humans are almost identical with very little variation across groups when it comes to our genotype. However, we also are, in terms of physical appearances, one of the most varied species on the planet, and we look very different from one another. Now that our appearance is governed by phenotypes. Now, phenotypes are kind of they're epigenetics. They are not connected to how intelligent you are. They're not connected to your athletic ability, anything like that. It only governs appearances. Things like how much melanin the cells in your skin produce, texture of hair, things along those lines. And what we see is while there's a great deal of human variety in terms of appearance, there's just not much in terms of those deeper genetics I was talking about, the genotype. So, race is something that exists as a social reality. People act on it. People treat it as though it were a real thing, but it also has no biological basis whatsoever. There is no biological science of race. I mean, the Nazis tried to create one, but it just doesn't work. And the reason is that you don't have distinct races per se. I mean, you have societies that act as though there are distinct races and treat people as distinct races. But what I mean by that is if you look at the whole range of human variety across the entire world, that what you see is just an incredible amount of variation from between groups. And so you would find groups that might have a hodgepodge of characteristics that we in the United States would label as belonging to different racial groups. Um, and so the thing is that um, when you try to create a social reality on something that has no material basis whatsoever, you end up getting a lot of contradictions. Just to give you an example, in the United States, this is coming from the research of Ian Haney Lopez in looking at our legal construction of race over the course of the 1800s and early 1900s. And keep in mind, during the 19th century and early 20th century, in many parts of the country, you had to be white in order to own property. And the racial structure in the United States was basically white and black, and that was it. And that those were the two dominant racial categories that Americans thought with. Now, the end of the 19th century ended up bringing in a lot of new immigrants, immigrants from Southern Europe. Workers being brought in from China, and so you had a lot of groups who ended up having to go to court to sue for whiteness, and it illustrates just the absurdity of all of this, in that whether or not, if you were, say, Chinese, and you wanted to own property and you had to go and sue to be considered white so that you would be legally able to own property. I mean, it came down to the judges oftentimes. And so some judges would decide that the Chinese person was white, and they could buy property. Sometimes they would be labeled as black, and the racial categories were always oriented around, in the United States, around this white black dichotomy. All right. So, what about ethnicity? Well, ethnicity is more about your cultural background. So today, I mean, as a result of the racial prerequisite cases I was just talking about in our legal system, today we end up seeing that whiteness has expanded. And so the number of people who are now considered white is much greater than what you would find, say, just 60, 70 years ago. And so, for instance, the Irish now are considered white. They didn't used to be. Italians, Greeks, didn't used to be. And so this is one of those things. Arab groups considered white didn't used to be. And so what that means is that you have this racial category, whiteness, but then you also have a lot of ethnicities within that. And so the ethnicity might be Irish or Italian or English or what have you, depending on your cultural background. And you can do this with any racial category. Within any racial category, you're going to have different ethnicities. It's also important to understand that ethnicity just refers to your cultural background. So all people who have been raised in a society and in a culture have an ethnicity. Everyone has an ethnicity. If you're human, you have an ethnicity. If you've been socialized as human, we talked about that earlier. So, the idea that there are pure races, for instance, it's ideological and false. There's been there's so much variety that, again, even when we are looking at genetics, you cannot establish this notion of a pure race. And the further back you go in terms of history to antiquity, and you see the migration patterns of humans and the interactions, the trade routes, um, we've been different groups from different geographic regions of the world have been intermixing with one another for thousands of years. Not to mention, we can go all the way back to we all started in Eastern Africa, modern humans, around 200,000 years ago. Of course, humans in general began a couple million years ago, but modern humans have been around about 200,000 years. And there were at least two migrations out of Africa, and everyone outside of Africa is descended from one of those groups. So this is one of the reasons, for instance, why we see the most genetic variety or variability among humans in on the continent of Africa. So that's not to say that there's huge variety. For instance, just to give you an example of a species that actually looks almost identical to one another. Emperor penguins. Emperor penguins look very similar to one another, yet there's actually more genetic variety among emperor penguins than what you find among humans. Um, I'm gonna have to get better at the etiquette with these films. I'm noticing that I'm watching myself instead of looking at the camera, and that's gonna look weird to you all. All right, all right. Um, moving on. So, the concept of race itself, and because humans can't, we have this tendency to not just say, okay, there's difference, we look different. There's beauty in all the difference and all the variety and all the variation in terms of phenotypes. We end up instead ranking things, and especially in the modern moment, um, in terms of inferior and superior. And thinking about the concept of race, or even having the concept of race, where you end up thinking in terms of superior and inferior, ends up leading to horrific kinds of things. And this would be whether you're talking about race or you're doing it with culture in terms of ethnicity, either way. And so, for instance, genocide is a world historic event that has occurred multiple times, dating back to antiquity, and it's the systematic annihilation or attempted annihilation. Genocides don't have to be successful in order to be considered genocides of a people because of their presumed race or ethnicity. So, in other words, I mean, people get caught up in genocides who aren't even a part of the group that's being targeted. They're close enough. I mean, take the Nazis and the Holocaust, for example. They were using what they called the racial science of the time. I mean, and we're using the term science loosely here. It was, I don't even want to call it pseudoscience, more of mythology. But anyways, they would have these charts with different phenotypic characteristics, and they would go on the street and just hold those up. The SS would go and hold it up to people's faces and say, "Oh no." That you have these characteristics, then you must be Jewish, and so going to the Holocaust. Um, And so, I mean, they grabbed people who were not even a part of the groups that they were trying to target. Um, all right. Now, while few Americans outright in public agree that other races are inferior to their own, they do tend to express ethnocentrism in what they think the culture and values associated with their race is superior. And so, if before World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust, um, uh, people in Europe, white scientists in the Western world more generally, would considered their race to be superior by virtue of some kind of biological factor. And we've seen some attempts to bring that back, like arguments about IQ testing, which, by the way, IQ testing is rife with cultural bias. That and class bias that far better explain differences and variations of IQ than actual intelligence, that we don't even have a clear scientific definition of what that word means. Well, I mean, what does it mean to be intelligent? And there's so many different ways people can be intelligent. But anyways, you see, even biological racism tries to come back up. But what we're talking about here is that since World War II, people have, on some level, understood that biological racism is incredibly dangerous to believe in. And so instead, they have focused, particularly since the 1950s, on this notion of cultural racism or cultural superiority, or other words, ethnocentrism. All right. Now, the language in sociology varies. We talk about minority groups. We also talk about majority groups. Majority group is uh, typically synonymous with dominant group, but not always. Um, It depends on how the sociologist is using the language. So, for instance, if I were talking about a numerical majority, I would say numerical majority. But if I say majority group, typically what I mean by that is a question of power. Now, as we're going to get into in the next chapter when we talk about gender, uh, one of the things that we see in the United States is actually that women outnumber men. Yet we live in a patriarchal society, such as women getting paid so much less than men doing the same jobs and having the same educational background. Um, so, in this way, uh, men are the numerical minority, but the social majority or dominant group in terms of gender. Now, minority groups are singled out by dominant groups. Dominant groups are dominant because they have the ability to designate labels, stigmas, parse out access to resources, opportunities, and it also doesn't mean that every single member of the dominant group is directly involved in this. Because, of course, you always will have people in the dominant group who are also disempowered, disenfranchised, and living in poverty. And you'll always be able to find people in the minority groups who are relatively powerful, who have lots of money, who are wealthy. Um, that doesn't change the overall pattern. That is simply pointing out that there are exceptions. And of course, there are. So, for instance, if we were going to talk about this in terms of intersectionality in sociology, that's looking at how different groups or different ways of grouping people end up intersecting and influencing one another. So, for instance, European Americans are the dominant group in America, but you also see that European Americans are the largest group on, say, social assistance, for instance, in America as well. So does that mean then that those people who are European Americans who are living in poverty have all of this power and are able um, uh, to do these large economic policies and decide how banks parse out loans or educational opportunities or what have you? No, of course not. Um, what that means is, and what we're getting into here is this concept of white privilege. And white privilege is much more about what you don't have to put up with than what you do have to put up with. So we all have to in the United States, live under this economic class system. Um, but at the same point in time, you might have to deal with being in a lower class position and the difficulty that that brings financially. But that doesn't mean that you also are going to, if you are part of the dominant group, that you're going to have to worry about other things, other threats to your life or livelihood that come about because of membership in a minority group. And so oftentimes this question of privilege is much more about what you don't have to put up with than what you are having to put up with. Um, all right. So there are two basic ways that minority groups are created. First, through the expansion of political boundaries, such as the U.S. in 1848, and actually with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States legally designated Mexican Americans as being white for the purposes of land ownership. And so this has also created this kind of strange ambiguity when it comes to Latinx populations. Is Latinx or Hispanic, is that, I mean, because technically that's an ethnicity, and then that ethnicity breaks down into many subgroups within that, and so sub ethnicities as you get more specific, and there's a lot of variety. But it's generally also created Latinx populations in the United States as being uh, treated as both an ethnicity and a race simultaneously. Um, so the second one is through migration. And by migration, we mean, and I mean, talk about a sanitized word. It could be voluntary. People might want to immigrate, or it could be forced, as in the case of the transatlantic slave trade. So, how did race and ethnic identities, how does it get constructed? Why do some people have a strong sense of ethnicity while others have only a weak sense of ethnicity? Well, sociologist Ashley Dohm identified four social characteristics that will lead people to develop a strong sense of ethnicity and is separate from the dominant group. So these are the characteristics that will determine whether or not someone feels strongly about their ethnic identity. The first one is size, the size of the group itself. The second is power, how much power they have. Three, appearance. How does the group look in comparison to whatever the dominant group looks like or is thought to look like? And then fourth, social inequality or discrimination based on race and ethnicity. If those four characteristics are present, so you have a smaller group from the dominant group, you have less social power than the dominant group, your appearance marks you out as separate or different from the dominant group, and you face discrimination from the social systems and the society uh, that you live in and is your home, then you are more likely to have a very strong sense of a racial or ethnic identity. Whereas if those things are not present, then you're not going to have as strong of an identity. And so this is why race is something that is talked about, according to self-report studies, much more in minority communities. It's talked about much more openly than it is in white communities, and where oftentimes, particularly in the middle class, among middle class whites, and higher economically speaking, um, race is oftentimes not even discussed at all. It's pretended like it doesn't even exist as a social reality. So, ethnic work. Ethnic work are activities designed to discover, enhance, maintain, or transmit an ethnic or racial identity. It's a way of of communicating with others your strong identification with your racial or ethnic group. Now, while in the past, historically, this started at the beginning of the 20th century, based on a play actually, um, that the United States is a melting pot, and that we're all blending together. That's by sociologists, it's mainly considered a myth today. Um, and the analogy, or the not the analogy, the metaphor that is more commonly used at this point would be a salad bowl. That we all are living in this country that is all ours, but at the same point in time, we're divided up into our different groups and different parts. And as we see, there's still a great deal of racial and ethnic segregation, despite the ending of legal segregation. It is still That's one of the things we've inherited from the past, and that is continued. Um, so, let's also talk about some basic words that people will oftentimes mix up, and will use interchangeably. Um, so, prejudice, discrimination, racism. Those do not all mean the same things. So, prejudice is quite literally to prejudge somebody before you even know them. And so it's typically in a negative way, but prejudices are not always negative. Prejudices are sometimes also positive. And those prejudices that are positive can also be damaging. And so, for instance, Asian Americans have spoken to the prejudice that they all know martial arts and are great with math. And well, no, not a lot of Asian Americans don't know martial arts and are no better at math than anyone else is, and some are horrible at math. But the prejudice ends up putting this social pressure on them to perform in certain ways, that if they don't live up to, they've somehow failed at something, and what they failed at is living up to the prejudice. And so that's not really a failure on their part so much as a failure on the society for having such prejudices to begin with. Now, discrimination is putting prejudice into action. People can have a prejudice against a particular group, but also try to check that if they're self-aware and they realize that they're being prejudiced, and they can stop from putting that prejudice into action and not actually bring about discrimination. But you have to be self aware and know that those prejudices are in you in order to stop discrimination, or from you and being engaged in discrimination. Um, so, discrimination is any act of unfair treatment directed against an individual or a group based on perceived group membership. Now, racism. Henslin gives you more of a lay definition of racism and talks about when prejudice and discrimination come together, and targets particular racial groups. Now, that's how most people who are not professional sociologists who have studied race and ethnicity think about the concept of racism. But racism itself is much more about social systems. It's about, for instance, a legal system that slants uh, property rights in the favor of one racial group over another, or finds a way to misuse the law in order to discriminate against a particular group or another. Racism is typically understood in sociology as being about more than just prejudice and discrimination based on race. And that is a part of it, but it's about how these systems themselves end up working. So I'll give you an example. When the GI Bill was first passed, it was to give returning veterans, returning soldiers, an opportunity to get an education and to move up the class ladder through education. But there was a caveat there within the GI Bill that said that if you were an agricultural worker, that you were ineligible for the GI Bill, and therefore you couldn't tap into that to go to college. Well, nowhere did it say, these particular racial groups are not allowed to. But who did you have doing most of the agricultural labor? You had African Americans, you had Latinx Americans, you had certain Asian American groups, and so all of whom served in the military and have served in the military with distinctions. No surprise there, many Americans have. The point is that uh, one caveat in the GI Bill doesn't sound like it's racially motivated, but it was, and it slanted policy against certain races and ethnicities being able to take advantage of that policy to get an education. Well, obviously, that's no longer a part of the GI Bill today, but that's just an example of how racism is about social systems, institutions, policies. And it's not just about what an individual person or a small group of people may do or not do. All right. Now, we learn prejudices from others. Prejudice is something that's learned. Children, very young children, don't see color. They don't see differences between people who just look different or have different color of skin than themselves. Prejudice is learned. Michael Kimmel, who is a well-renowned sociologist, did research on hate groups in Sweden. And what he found was very interesting, is that people were joining these hate groups not because they actually hated the groups at first that the hate groups targeted. It was because they had a friend or a family member who was a part of the hate group, and then they were looking for something to do, and they wanted to hang out with their friend, and so they went to a rally, and they became radicalized, and were taught these prejudices as positive things, and hate as a positive value. Um, and this works more strongly, learning these prejudices and putting them into action, especially when groups are segregated from one another. So, one of the things that we've found in the social sciences more generally is something that's called contact theory. Simply being more in contact with a variety of different cultural groups, racial groups, what have you, decreases prejudice. And because you can't hang out with people for extended periods of time, have lots of interactions with them, and not see the humanity in the people that you're interacting with. So one of the problems is the very segregation that we have, and we're not only segregated in terms of residence and in terms of the kinds of occupations that are open to different groups, and what schools people go to. But we're also, as we've discussed, segregated by our social networks themselves. So, contact theory. Contact theory is the idea that prejudice, negative stereotypes decrease, and racial and ethnic relations improve when people from different racial ethnic backgrounds who are of equal status interact frequently. Now that's important, of equal status. So you're not talking about if you interact with somebody that is providing you a service of some sort, because, well, you're not of equal status in that context. So many, most people who are prejudiced against particular groups have had very little, if any, contact with the groups that they're actually prejudiced against. And so this is why people talk openly about prejudice coming from ignorance. And ignorance can be taught, just like knowledge can be taught. Now, in 1946, there was a psychologist by the name of Eugene Hartley. And Eugene tested people on prejudice against certain groups. And he added three groups that he just made up, that were not real groups. And those prejudiced against other groups were also prejudiced against the fictional groups and assigned all these negative values to them. And so, again, it's highlighting that you don't even know who this group is because Eugene Hartley just made them up, but because you're feeling fearful or threatened by the unknown, since you don't know the group, then you're more likely to assign negative values to them. All right. Now, people of all races and ethnicities have internalized dominant norms of the mainstream cultures they live in. This can be illustrated by, again, psychologists Marzarin Banerjee and Anthony Greenwald, who developed the implicit association test. Claude Steele is another, he was a social psychologist who was very much involved in this as well. Wrote a really interesting book called Whistling Vivaldi, touching on some of the research coming out of this. But what they found with the implicit association test is that racial prejudice against minority groups were even present in the minority groups themselves. So here's what they would do, and you can do the implicit association test. Just Google implicit association test, it'll take you right to it. And you can take the test for yourself. Now, there's a whole bunch. They've really developed this test. So there are things in terms of ability, status, nationality, gender, sexuality, as well as race and ethnicity. And there's a whole bunch of different ones for race and ethnicity, even. And so what they'll have you do is they'll test your reaction time. Because it's trying to get at unconscious prejudices that you might not even be aware that you have. So what the implicit association test does is they'll have you put your fingers on two buttons on your keyboard on your computer. And then they will show you, say, a picture of a screwdriver, and then they will show you someone who would be considered white by American standards, or someone who would be considered black by American standards, and you have to put, is it a tool or a weapon? And then they test how fast you do it or if they associate, say, the screwdriver with a white face versus if they associate the screwdriver with a black face. I'm using a really simple example, but that's basically how the implicit association test works. And I strongly recommend for my students to go and take it. It can be a very enlightening experience and lead to greater self-awareness, greater self-understanding. So, when I was talking about racism and how it was understood in a much more systemic way, there's actually another term for that. It's called institutional discrimination. And in sociology, we distinguish between individual discrimination, what individuals do in face-to-face interaction with one another, versus this institutional discrimination or systemic discrimination, as it's also called. like what I was talking about in terms of policies, or for instance, in terms of the criminal justice system. The 13th Amendment, which is one of the Freedom Amendments, has a loophole in it that you can still practice slavery in the United States if it's punishment for a crime. And so that loophole was used and it still has been used to disenfranchise minorities at much greater rates than any other group, particularly African Americans and Latinx Americans. Now, when we're looking at institutional discrimination, there are two examples we can use to illustrate the point. I've actually used several, but there's two that are uh, talked about directly in your textbook, and that's housing and healthcare. So, the housing bubble of the early 21st century was artificially created by banks pushing people into predatory loans, such as subprime loans, or now what they're calling reverse mortgage loans, that make it nearly impossible to pay off the principal on the loan. Largely because the interest rate keeps changing and keeps going up. And it gets to the point where people can no longer afford to pay it just because of how high the interest rate is. Now, in healthcare, much of the inequalities we see in gender also impacts race, with doctors, regardless of the doctor's race, tending to give more preventative care to white patients than particularly African American patients and Latinx patients. Explaining the racial differences that are cataloged in the textbook. So we also have unintentional discrimination. Unintentional discrimination it comes about when people are acting on values, assumptions, interpretations, and prejudices that they have that are coming from the dominant culture, and they don't realize that applying those values are having racially disparate effects. For instance, the in media, you often see African Americans depicted as being impoverished, and that completely ignores the very large middle class and this much smaller but still existent upper class of African Americans, economically speaking, too. Um, and so, if you go into a bank, say you have someone who's a bank loan officer, and you have somebody who's European American, someone who's African American, same credit score, both in the middle class. The European American ends up getting a decent loan for a house, a decent mortgage, whereas the African American person who comes in is pushed into a subprime loan or reverse mortgage or what have you, simply because of the association with poverty and the larger values, even though this particular person is not impoverished. Um, and so this is how unintentional discrimination ends up occurring. It's not that somebody's saying, aha, I'm going after you because I hate the group that I perceive you to be a part of. The same we can see with policing. When police kill innocent young black men and they say they felt threatened. Well, again, it doesn't mean that this officer's, in part of the KKK or neo-Nazi groups, or that they identify with white supremacy as an ideology at all. But the image of African Americans as being threatening is all through American culture, all through movies, all through music. For instance, keep in mind that rap as a musical genre began in a block party in the late 70s in New York. And it was full of just talking about what life is like at the intersection of race and class, and talking about it. And also intersections of gender. And it was very socially aware and had a message. There was a lot of meaning behind the lyrics. And then you had white corporate music executives doing starting labels, um, or recruiting black artists to basically start the genre of gangsta rap, which ended up depicting African Americans as being just inherently threatening. And that wasn't what rap started out as. And there's a lot of people, a lot of artists who have been trying to, and successfully, I think, in my own view, reclaim the genre and bring back those social values that it began with, before it was became so heavily commercialized. So, these are the kinds of things that bring about unintentional discrimination when somebody is not consciously aware of their prejudices, but because those prejudices exist in the larger culture, they're a part of the larger culture, and they end up acting on them. All right. Now, there are many different theories of prejudice, and keep in mind, like what we were talking about when we were talking about the big theories, right? Remember, the big theories in sociology are conflict theory, structural functionalism, and symbolic interactionism. And if you remember, when I was explaining those different theories and the things that they have in common with one another, and I said there's a lot of sub theories under these theories, a lot of different schools of thought, and these are just big umbrella terms that we use to talk about general schools, but that actually sociological theories work best in conjunction with one another. And so it's not like the theories of prejudice I'm going to go through. It's pick, which one you feel speaks to you. It's like, no, all of this is kind of going on um, simultaneously to varying degrees. So, psychological perspective in terms of theories of prejudice. When people are frustrated by a larger problem that they do not understand, such as economic depression that hit Germany following the Treaty of Versailles ending World War One, they will look for a simple explanation, someone they can villainize, someone they can say, if something is too systemic and understanding it is something that's too complex, too abstract, that takes study in order to understand what the actual problem is. It's much easier to say, no, I don't want to bother learning all of that stuff or studying all that stuff. It's this group over here that I've always been kind of suspicious of to begin with. They're the real problems. And that's what's called scapegoating. Now, there were some cultures in the past, in tribal societies, that would have literal scapegoats. So what they would do is they would bring out a goat, and people would end up like writing what they considered their sins, or things they're guilty of, or things other people are guilty of, or suspicions, and then they would pin it to the goat, or just whisper it to the goat, and then the goat would be killed. And then, so that's where the terminology scapegoat actually comes from. Um, and we can see, using the example of Germany and the economic depression following World War One, that was much more about the how the Treaty of Versailles placed all blame on Germany for World War One, and so the German people were poor and desperate following that, and it was a recipe for the horrors that we ended up seeing in the Holocaust again, with actually several groups being scapegoated. Uh, Jews, as most people know, but also gay and lesbian people, um, people of African ancestry, or well, we all have African ancestry in a sense, so people with more recent African ancestry. Um, Gypsies, Marxists. I mean, some they were going after people for their ideologies as well. Um, Now, the more frustrated someone is, if there's prejudice in them, and this prejudice could be subconscious and still get expressed directly. So, the more frustrated someone is, the more prejudice they will express, leading to another term, camouflage racism. So, camouflage racism. Say, for instance, now I'm driving around, you get cut off all the time. You have rude drivers, inconsiderate drivers, people who are also just oblivious and not paying attention, or they're stuck in their own minds, or they're in a conversation with a passenger, or on the phone, or what have you, and they cut you off. Now, I mean, I've been cut off like this by people of about every race and ethnicity you can imagine. Uh, Beaumont's actually a very racially and ethnically diverse area. Um, but however, camouflage racism would be, imagine that you were hyper aware when an Asian driver, for instance, cut you off. Well, there's a stereotype, a racial prejudice in America about Asian drivers, or Asian Americans being bad drivers. And so whereas you might have friends who are Asian Americans, coworkers, people you interact with, and then you still find yourself saying something like, uh, "Why can't Asians learn how to drive?" That is camouflage racism. That is an example right there of it. And people will say, "Well, I'm not racist against Asian Americans. I've got a good friend who's Asian American." It's, well, you can have these prejudices and still socially interact with people of different groups. I mean, these are not mutually exclusive kinds of things. All right. Now, the next concept we're going to look at is authoritarian personality. Now, authoritarian personality is something that is coming largely from Theodore Adorno, though there's been a lot of research beyond just Adorno. There is, I mean, a whole book that was published on it with multiple researchers involved. And this is a term for people who rank high on prejudice and high on scales of conformity and tolerance in general for people who are just different in any way, even of their own groups. Feelings of fear and insecurity. We've actually now more recently been able to do MRI brain scans on people, and we found that people with who tested high on these things tend to have a much larger amygdala, are a fear center of the brain. And so these people with the authoritarian personality also tend to have a high degree of respect for authority and tend to be very submissive to those that they perceive to be their superiors. And so the authoritarian personality um, makes it much more likely that scapegoating is going to occur, that discrimination is going to occur in varying degrees. Now, let's look at some of the more general sociological uh, theoretical schools. So, functionalism, so structural functionalism, functional analysis, it goes by multiple names, as we've discussed. Um, the general feel for functional theorists is that prejudice works in that it solidifies social bonds in the in-group. So the group that feels prejudice and have prejudiced beliefs feel more connected with one another because of those prejudices. However, it creates greater conflict with those groups defined as the outgroups. And so this is getting into the in-group, out-group dynamics that we talked about with symbolic interactionism as well. This is just on a much larger scale. Now, empirical studies have found that if you put two groups in a state of competition, even if they were close friends beforehand, they'll identify with their group and display prejudice against their former friends. For citations, just refer to your textbook. There's a whole list of studies that have demonstrated this. Now, conflict theory. Conflict theory argues that race and ethnicity, as well as gender and sexuality, keep workers fighting with each other instead of organizing for or recognizing their common class position and organizing for something better. And so there's a couple of ways that this works. First, there's a split labor market in the United States. Workers are split along racial and ethnic, gender and age, and many other lines. And this split is exploited by owners of the means of production, such as businesses themselves, to weaken the bargaining power of workers. And so when you have people split up across all these different demographics, and these different demographics are expected to be in particular occupations or even within the same company, then they might not see themselves as necessarily being connected with one another or sharing a common class position because of those other perceived differences. Then you also have the reserve labor force, or the industrial reserve army. The reserve labor force are the unemployed, the underemployed, also workers who are thought of as being in reserve. And capitalists will take them out of reserve or put them back into the workforce during times of high production or in times of labor strife, labor conflict with labor. And so these would be people crossing picket lines because they're so economically desperate that they need the work, they need the job, they need the money. And then they're laid off again, though, when they're no longer needed. And so it's not that there are all these people who are unemployed who don't want to work. That's not the case at all. Can you find somebody who's unemployed who doesn't want to work? I'm sure you can. There's all kinds of variations among humanity, but for the most part, people want to work. They don't want to be poor. They want to work in a rewarding job that they feel valuable. So let's turn our attention then to symbolic interactionism, how that works. So, how do labels then create stereotypes that then guide social interactions between people of different social backgrounds? Well, one is selective perception, where people see certain features of an object or situation but remain blind to others. So, for instance, going back to my example of a driver who happens to be Asian American cutting you off on the road, and the camouflage racism comes about. Well, did you also notice when the European American person cut you off? I mean, did that bring up feelings of why can't white people learn to drive? Probably not. And you probably didn't even think about it in terms of race in those regards. And so that then is the selective perception. So you'll be more primed to see or to notice things that sync up with prejudices and stereotypes in your culture, and you will be less likely to notice things that contradict those stereotypes or prejudices. Stereotypes also become self-fulfilling prophecies. So then, for instance, if people as a group are stereotyped as being lazy, for example, then people won't hire them and they can't find work, leading to unemployment and a lot of free time, which then people see as evidence that, yes, see, that they really are lazy. And no, the stereotype and prejudice is becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, and people are unable to find work because of that. All right. Now, this is not just, while our focus has been on the United States, this is not something that just happens in the United States. Um, with one of the consequences, culturally speaking, that we've inherited as a world, as a species, from the age of European imperialism and colonization is that most countries at this point in time have some concept or conceptualization of race, but it's or an ethnicity, but it's not thought of the same in every culture in every country. Um, I mean, for instance, in Brazil, whether you're considered white or black has more to do with your economic standing than the amount of melanin in your skin. Um, So, what are the global patterns that we end up seeing, not just around the world, but also in the US too? Well, I've already mentioned genocide. That's one of them. Um, so, how can people commit acts such as genocide? You have to end up denying the humanity of another group. You have to turn that part of your brain that sees a fellow human being off and instead see them as being just fundamentally different and other from you. Um, I mean, how could the US government encourage the wiping out of 95% of Native Americans through the ideological justification of manifest destiny, for example? Um, compartmentalize, compartmentalization. That's where you end up in the back of your head. You file away the humanity of the group you're targeting. You say, no, no. I can see that they're fellow human beings, but I'm going to not think about that and instead focus on the prejudices that I have that uh, makes it seem or makes me angry at this group for whatever reason. We also see population transfer, out of sight, out of mind. It's a forced transfer of a minority group to another place. So, a reservation or a concentration camp. Take your pick. This can be direct or indirect. Direct is forced resettlement. Indirect is when conditions are made so unbearable for a group that they have little choice but to leave. So, for instance, say that you have a neighborhood that is predominantly European American, and you have an African American family move in, and they end up, waking up to seeing nooses hanging in the tree of their front yard. I mean, threats like that, terroristic threats along those lines, can also end up leading to population transfers and maintain segregation. So, and that also makes it then easier because remember contact theory, if you're not in contact with the group, then your prejudices are never challenged. The other thing is, and this is something, this language was intended to, in during the Balkan Wars, used by Milosevic. Um, when Serbians were rounding up Croatians and Bosnian Muslims and um, committing genocide. They called it ethnic cleansing. So this is a policy of eliminating a population, includes forcible expulsion and genocide. Now, that was intended as a euphemism back in the 90s, ethnic cleansing. Today, I think most people who are aware of that concept hear it as having the same just kind of evilness as genocide. We also see other ways of keeping people separate in terms of internal colonialism. So, internal colonialism would be the policy of exploiting minority groups for economic gain and keeping them colonized separately. You can see this with African Americans who are living in poverty, who are segregated, and yet who are working from dawn to dusk, if not more, and still struggling to make ends meet. And they're pumping a lot of value into the economy just based on their labor. Or you can look at it in terms of reservations for Native Americans. Um, but yeah, internal colonialism. And then obviously segregation itself, whether as a legal policy or as a practice that's been handed down through the generations of keeping different races and ethnicity groups separate. Now, we're going to get into things that are a little more complicated. Assimilation. So, in the 1800s and the 1900s in the United States, and you still see it today in the 21st century, this push to, okay, you have to, if you're going to be a part of this country, you have to do everything that we say. You have to practice the culture that is dominant, that's dominated by European Americans, for instance. You have to assimilate and become a part of the country. And if you try to keep some part of your cultural background alive or your ethnicity alive, then you're not true Americans or real Americans, right? So, but at the same point in time, assimilation is also talked about in terms of uh, people being accepted within the society. And you see, for instance, with Mexican Americans who are third generation immigrants, a high degree of assimilation, for instance, where by third generation, Mexican Americans oftentimes will not even, they will be monolingual, and the language being English, and that's all they know how to speak. And that's actually really common and a sign of assimilation. But then it raises questions about losing one's cultural heritage. Um, so there are some other concepts here that are very close to one another. It's multiculturalism and pluralism. We've already talked about how the United States is a pluralistic society. We are made up of many different groups, many different cultural groups. Now, multiculturalism is a policy that permits or encourages ethnic differences and respecting ethnic differences to keep the different cultures alive. Um, Now, pluralism is a little bit different in terms of how it's meant in this context, because pluralism as a political push would be the diffusion of power among many different groups so that all the groups have, say, equal representation, that prevents any single group from gaining control of the government, gaining control of the economy through corporations. Of course, in that regard, we do not live in a pluralistic society. Um, Now, race and ethnicity are fluid. The ways that different racial groups or different ethnic groups are defined change, and you can have ethnogenesis, where you can have the creation of a new ethnicity if you have different cultures coming together and blending to create something new. And so we also see racial categories. For instance, what is considered white today, racially speaking, would be very different from what was considered white 100 years ago in the United States, even. And the language that people identify with change over time as well. And so race is not so much about your genetic heritage, because you might actually, a lot of people have more in common genetically with people who are defined as being of a different race than of people that are considered within their own racial category, even. So it's not so much about genetic heritage as it is the social readings or the perceptions of the audience who are actively imposing cultural meaning onto your appearance. And so, in this way, we don't get to say what race we are. That's imposed upon us by how others perceive us and then how we're treated based on that. Now, no term in talking about race and ethnicity is perfect, and no term will last forever. And terms that were considered the politically correct terms in the past are considered offensive today because of how they were used. Terms that are considered politically correct today will probably be considered offensive in the future. For instance, I would not be surprised if in the future we see even using the concept of color to talk about race at all in terms of white or black. It becomes entirely unacceptable. Um, uh, that that seems to be a direction we're headed in. A direction that Western Europe headed in as well after they invented all this stuff. Anyway, the point is simply that we should be sensitive to language. Just as you would want somebody to respect your self understanding and how you see yourself, um, then if you want people to respect your self identification and your self understandings, then you should respect other people's self identifications and understandings. And if somebody is offended by a term, then you shouldn't use that term to talk about that person. It's as simple as that. It's about respect and recognizing shared human dignity. All right. Now, there are many different racial groups that make up the United States. You can go through and definitely do go through in your textbooks the demographic breakdown of what percentage of the population is considered what group. But let's just talk about some of them. European Americans. Now, as I've already said, European Americans are the dominant group in the US, and being the dominant group comes with special privileges that many actually don't even realize they're receiving. Um, Peggy McIntosh wrote a really influential article about masculine and white privilege and talked about it as being this invisible knapsack. And it was things like, she can walk in a store, and if somebody comes up, a store clerk, and asks her if she needs help, she doesn't have to feel like they're trying to just look for excuses to watch to make sure she doesn't steal, that they're not acting in a discriminatory way. Um, and and well, just there's a whole section in your textbook that breaks down Peggy McIntosh and what she says in that article. Make sure to take a look at that because for the final exam, I will possibly generate some questions from that. Now, we also see other concepts such as WASPs. WASPs are a much more specific group. WASP stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So this would be a particular ethnicity within the broader racial category of European Americans. And WASPs separate themselves and see themselves as distinct from white ethnics or white immigrants to the US whose cultures differ from WASP culture. For instance, you see still a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment among Protestants. And so we can also talk about how Protestants are a dominant group in the United States in terms of religion and power. Then we see Latinx populations or Hispanics. This is an umbrella term that lumps people with very different histories and very different cultures into a single ethnic group. Um, and oftentimes, when it comes to Latinx populations, people think about immigration, but Latinx populations have always been a part of what is today the United States. And when we're talking about Latinx populations, we're talking about people who, by and large, are Native Americans. And so this idea that Native Americans are immigrating to a part of America, and that European Americans are assumed to be the default citizens, is tragic and ironic. So Latinx populations or Hispanic. Let's talk about immigration, for instance. I mean, there's always push and pull factors. Nobody wakes up one day and says, I'm going to leave my family. I'm going to leave my friends. I'm going to leave my social networks. I'm going to leave the culture that I know best and that I have the best understanding of, and move to a place where I don't understand the culture as well. And I have lost my social network, and I have just occasional interactions with my friends and family back home. Nobody just wakes up and decides to do that for the most part. And again, there are always exceptions, but in general, people like to stay where they feel comfortable. And so, anytime you do see different groups immigrating, um, it's about what those push and pull factors are. What is pushing them out of their country? Is it violence because of political unrest, because of a more powerful country going in and staging coups, or economically and militarily backing insurgents groups? And because of that violence, is that a pushing you out of your country? And then what about pull factors like the demand for cheap labor in a split labor market? But you're still going to be able to make more money in the other society than you would at home. And so that, if you want to understand why people do immigrate, you want to look at both of the push and the pull factors. Now, African Americans. African Americans, now, as because of a history of racial exclusion and exploitation of Black Americans, and the white-black color line in the United States is one of the most heavily policed, and I mean that informally as well as formally. In terms of, as we talked about in Chapter 6 on deviance in the criminal justice systems, um, uh, unequal treatment in the CJS. But the exclusion and exploitation of Black Americans did not end after the Civil War, as I've already stated. And we see 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court upheld Jim Crow segregation, an institution that did not officially end until the passage of the civil rights legislation in 1964 and 1965. But we're still seeing the effects of the history and inequality today. When you have, uh, over 500 years of this kind of cultural set of beliefs and prejudices and practices of exclusion, um, that's not something that just goes away. And we see even after the Civil War with Plessy versus Ferguson, it was ultimately decided that Black Americans had no rights that white Americans had to respect. That was our Supreme Court uh, decided that. Now, obviously, it was overturned with the civil rights legislation of 64 and 65, but look at that, from 1896 up until the 1960s, the mid 1960s. And people want to act like, well, we fought a civil war over slavery and ended slavery, and everything was fine after that. No, that's just not how the world works. And it's a little naive to think that way. All right. With the successes of the civil rights movement and the passage of civil rights legislation, we see a condition called rising expectations, the sense that better conditions are soon to follow. Now, here's the problem with rising expectations is that if the legislation gets passed, but then it rarely gets enacted or only gets enacted in certain cases, and people are still facing very similar conditions as before, then it increases social conflict and frustration. Now, while things